In Hitler's philosophy, the existence of the race and the nation was linked to the amount of territory and resources at the nation's disposal, and the survival of Germany could only be guaranteed by expanding its living space in Europe. By mid-1920, Hitler had set his mind on territorial expansion, which was to provide the resources needed to sustain Germany and develop it into a world power that could not be oppressed by other nations. The territory was to be found in Eastern Europe, where Soviet Russia, due to alleged Jewish influence, was ripe for collapse, and Hitler believed that destiny had chosen the German people to witness the collapse of the Soviet regime and grab the territory in the East. On February 3, 1933, Hitler laid out in rough detail his plan of conquest towards the East, but around 1937 the initial hope of coming to an agreement with Poland and Britain over border revisions at the expense of the Soviet Union in the East began to fade into the background, particularly in light of the British response to the Spanish Civil War, which Hitler had found demonstrative of an impermissible attitude towards the communist threat on the part of the Brits. By November 1937, Hitler was envisioning a more aggressive foreign policy that involved the expanding of the German living space by annexing Austria and Czechoslovakia, possibly as early as the next year. Indeed, Austria was annexed by Germany in March of the next year under the pretext of protecting ethnic German minorities there, and in late May 1938, following the weekend crisis with Czechoslovakia, which Hitler was assured had damaged his regime's prestige to an unforgivable extent, Hitler declared to his generals his intention of smashing the Czechoslovakian state militarily in the foreseeable future, believing that this would not provoke the conflict with the Western powers he was now convinced would eventually have to occur. By stoking up German Czechoslovak hostilities with dramatic tales about mistreatment of ethnic German minorities, Hitler managed to land himself into negotiations with the Brits, who were acting as peacekeepers, over the fate of the Czechoslovakian regions with these ethnic German minorities and whether they could be ceded to Germany. Hitler was unsure of the Czech president's compliance and stuck clandestinely to his original plans of taking military action against the whole of Czechoslovakia, but with the populace and most of the Nazi leadership being not as keen on such an outcome, Hitler pulled back from his plans and agreed to another round of negotiations. In the resulting discussion that took place in Munich, the government representatives present agreed that the Czech territories with ethnic Germans belonged to Germany. Thus, on September 30th, a treaty was signed to give Hitler the freedom to occupy the Czech territories in question, which he then did. Hitler wasn't, however, all too satisfied with this resolution that the Nazi leader Göring, above all, had worked hard to achieve. Annexing entire Czechoslovakia had long been Hitler's true intention, as we have seen, and in any case the pressing economic difficulties in Germany, and the strategic value the rest of Czechoslovakia had with respect to Hitler's long-term goals were making full annexation an ever more attractive prospect, despite the fact that this would be contrary to the treaty signed in Munich. Plans for a final death blow against what remained of Czechoslovakia were cooked up, and then in March 1939 Germany went on to occupy the rest of the Czechoslovakian nation. This action would turn out to have lasting consequences, since the Western powers, who had so far been aiding the German rearmament by eagerly granting concessions and backtracking on the restrictions placed on the German army after the First World War, and who had still been under the impression that Nazi foreign policy aims were mainly about uniting ethnic Germans into a single homeland, realized that such a policy had been a pretense, and finally gave up their policy of trying to appease Germany, as they realized that Hitler could not be trusted, and that he was not interested in simply righting the wrongs of the World War I Versailles Treaty. Next, Hitler turned his sights on Poland, and after the Poles had rejected his offers regarding the ethnic German region within Poland, Hitler became determined to deliver Czechoslovakia's fate to the Polish nation as well. While Nazi propaganda would naturally advertise stories about mistreatment of the Polish ethnic German minority in an attempt to justify military action against Poland, Hitler had already told his top generals on May 23rd that the upcoming invasion was not about the Polish region with ethnic Germans, i.e. Danzig, but rather about attaining living space and thus the resources needed for the future struggle for world power status against the Western powers, out of which Britain was now identified by Hitler as the primary enemy. The German attack on Poland came on September 1st, despite the warnings the Brits had been issuing since the destruction of Czechoslovakia in March, and once the final British warning expired 2 days after the invasion, war was declared on Germany, who was not withdrawing its troops from Poland as requested. This brief, and without a doubt oversimplified account of the start of the war is set to illustrate how crucial the living space doctrine turned out to be for the Nazi regime, and also how far disconnected from reality the white nationalist, pro-Nazi version of the war is. The white nationalist Nick Fuentes gulps down Nazi propaganda about uniting ethnic Germans hook, line, and sinker, while other white nationalists, like J.F. Gariepi, Henrik from Red Eyes, and the Golden One, insist on Nazi Germany's innocence by blaming an international Jewish conspiracy for the Second World War.
Look at the different expansionist projects. He had the Anschluss, where he took over Austria. Austria is part of Greater Germany. Austria is historically German. He took the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, historically German, big German population, and then he invaded Poland. He didn't take over Poland because this was part of his conquest of the planet. He took over, well, he invaded Poland to take Danzig, which was a corridor that was separated from Germany because of the Treaty of Versailles.
It seems that there is a force in this world that drives people toward war, and that a nation that has tried to get out, to not submit to this force, has been pushed into war against its will. And that's what seems to be what happened in World War II. How do we in the future?
We had a country which dared to defy the globalist bankers at the time, right? And that I feel is a huge reasoning for why what happened, and specifically to Germany, and the fact that
You're absolutely right.
This is kind of Germany is kind of like one of the, not the first countries, of course, but since they broke out of the system that already was in place in Europe, they were to be punished for their deeds, for their attempts to try to do what they try to do, right?
To put it simply, and I suggest that you read up on this as well because it's really interesting and presents a more realistic view of things. Germany got stomped into the dust, and the Second World War was about Germany trying to break off from the international banking system.
Just the facts we have gone through right now reveal this narrative, which is in many ways reminiscent of Nazi propaganda, to be little more than self-serving fan fiction, since it's difficult to reconcile it with the appeasement policy towards Nazi Germany that the Western powers had been committed to, and since it reduces Hitler's foreign policy aims to a simple concept other racial nationalists could easily sympathize with, without taking into account Hitler's plan of conquest towards Eastern Europe, expanding the German living space into Eastern Europe and developing Germany into a world power, which Hitler believed was required in order for Germany to survive as a nation, had been central components of Nazi foreign policy ever since the mid-1920s. Hitler continued to assert them as such on many occasions I haven't already brought up, like shortly before the invasion of Poland on August 22nd and on November 23rd, 1939. The establishing of the German living space on Polish territory could not be accomplished for as long as the ethnic Polish population remained, which was considered to be racially inferior and thus had to be driven towards the eastern half of Poland for the time being and subjugated there, once the Polish intelligentsia had been killed, of course. After Nazi Germany had begun its war of annihilation against the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Hitler set the tone for Nazi colonial policy in the former Soviet territories, which was to be centered on exploiting local resources and dominating the native Slavic peoples, while the SS, whose leaders had been inculcated with visions of a Germanic colonial empire based on racist domination, developed comprehensive plans to resettle the territories with ethnic Germans and ethnically cleanse most of the native population, a total of 31 million people according to the papers of the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories. Hitler never made any qualms about the conquering of the living space and often referenced his social Darwinist views about nature's order when justifying this act. He had little sympathy for the Slavs, who were born slaves according to one of Hitler's table talks, and neither did any other Nazi who considered the Slavs an inferior race. This gave way to an atmosphere of cruelty that would have been unthinkable in the Western European campaign. The most notorious examples of this cruelty are perhaps the savage hunger plan sketched out in advance which the Nazis were aware would probably lead to many millions of Soviet people starving to death. The deliberate starvation of nearly 1 million people in Leningrad, a fate Hitler had told the propaganda minister on November 22nd he wanted to mete out to the citizens of Moscow as well, and the starvation rations given to Soviet prisoners of war, of whom about 3 million would perish by the end of the war. The level of devastation the Nazis havoked on the Soviet Union has few parallels in all of world history. At least 20 million Soviet people were killed by 4 years of Nazi invasion and occupation, and only the Lord knows how many more would have died if Nazi Germany had won the war and implemented its ethnic cleansing plans properly. The similarities with white nationalism are not at all obvious, as you can see. White nationalists don't hate Eastern Europeans, and they have no plans of conquering any territory like Hitler did. Thus, the whole living space doctrine that brought the Nazis to war seems completely contradictory to the aims of white nationalism. If, for the sake of retaining the ideological comparison, we rephrase the living space doctrine to simply mean the securing of a living space that allows the race to flourish, in which case it doesn't have to entail expansionism if the living space is already considered adequate, we would not be taking into account Hitler's world power politics that had been central to his living space policy from the start. For most white nationalists, therefore, there are no obstacles for distancing themselves in a heartbeat from, in fact, the majority of Nazi atrocities by pointing out that they do not want to invade any places or subjugate any peoples, Slavic or other kind. I count this as a crucial difference between white nationalism and Nazism, but the fact that currently in the United States there are about 198 million people classified as white by the US Census Bureau leaves American white nationalists with a population of 130 million, that is 3 or 4 times as many as the Nazis had in Eastern Europe of people they regard as racial inferiors to ethnically cleanse. Whether this carries the same potential for death on this scale of millions and tens of millions will be explored later. Almost immediately after the Nazis came to power, they began placing occupational, educational, and other kind of restrictions on German Jews. Through legal restrictions, day-to-day harassment, spontaneous acts of violence, and a massive legislative and propaganda effort to segregate them from the rest of the population, the Nazis had successfully forced about 250,000 German Jews to leave their home country in the pre-war years. Approximately 20% of them had gone to Palestine, which had been facilitated by the deal the Nazis had struck with some Zionist organizations in hopes of reducing the German Jewish population while simultaneously softening international criticism over their anti-Jewish policies at a time when the German economy was particularly weak against boycotts of even the mildest kind. This was a controversial policy among the Nazi leadership. Hitler had earlier declared his opposition to the idea of a Jewish state, while some other leading Nazi figures saw benefits and little downsides to encouraging Zionist activity. In mid-1937, this Palestine policy came under heavy fire from the Nazi foreign minister, but even Hitler's intervention in favor of the policy in early 1938 could not save it from being abandoned in August 1938, when such emigration had already become difficult anyway. In the end, none of this did much to help the Nazis achieve their vision, since their expansionist policy brought under their dominion a Jewish population multiple times larger than the one they had so far managed to drive out through relatively peaceful means. The Nazi anti-Jewish policy had also taken a radical turn in the meanwhile, and the Jewish question was increasingly interpreted by our protagonists as a problem to be solved on a Europe-wide scale. By mid-1938, anti-Jewish agitation among the Nazi leadership was on the rise, and the propaganda minister, who also served as the regional party leader of Berlin, was the first to cooperate with the SS-controlled political police in organizing pogrom-like action against the German Jews. The action had to be cancelled out of concern for the developing foreign policy crisis, but the hostility continued, and throughout the fall of 1938, numerous Jewish places of worship were destroyed in random attacks. On November 7th, when the Munich Agreement had been signed and the foreign policy crisis had died down, the lid was blown off from this anti-Jewish hatred when a certain Jewish teenager shot a German diplomat in retaliation for his family being expelled from the country, which Nazi propaganda managed to twist within 24 hours into a narrative that blamed world Jewry for the murder, and with Hitler's backing the party organized a violent pogrom across the country. As is made clear by the rather extreme nature of their remarks issued around the time, including in Hitler's famous speech of January 30th, 1939, the November pogrom introduced a new, more brutal era in the Nazis' persecution of Jewish people. In the first 8 months of 1939, the Nazi leadership was for the most part preoccupied with annexing of the rest of the Czechoslovakian state early in the year and with preparing for the invasion of Poland, which then came on September 1st. While the Nazis began systematically murdering mental hospital patients and disabled people on their home turf in a program codenamed T4, SS task forces, who had been ordered to execute the intelligentsia of the Poles, were marching into Poland and in cohesion with the German army and a local militia, killed about 50,000 Poles before the year was done, some in connection with an euthanasia program similar to the T4 action. Even though many of their victims were Jewish, The main objective of Nazi anti-Jewish policy at this point was to concentrate the Jews under Nazi control into a temporary reservation on occupied Polish territory, from where the Jews could later be transported to an unspecified area. Ghettos began to be set up throughout German-occupied Poland, where Polish and German Jews could be resettled until transportation to the Jewish reservation located in the Nazi administration zone labeled the General Government, which existed in central Poland and later expanded into the whole of eastern Poland in the summer of 1941, when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was revised. The plan up until early 1940 was still to transport the Jews to a possible reservation either in the general government in Poland or nearby, but the fiery anti-Semitism characteristic of Nazism, expressed bluntly by the leader of the general government, had already introduced a mentality according to which letting some Jews starve or freeze to death was preferable than taking the efforts to make sure they have adequate living conditions. This was only a sign of the level of detestation underlying the Nazis' policies towards Jews, and a far cry from any program of systematic murder. In mid-1940, as the invasion of France approached and was completed, the Nazis selected the French African colony of Madagascar as the destination for the Jews under German control, now including most of Western Europe, of course. As surreal as it may seem that the Nazis were contemplating on transporting millions of Jews to an island thousands of miles away with an incredibly harsh climate, the Madagascar plan appears to have been taken seriously by the Nazis in the second half of 1940, but at the end of 1940, the plan was abandoned for good, and as concrete plans began to be made for the invasion of the Soviet Union, new possibilities for solving the so-called Jewish question were opening up. At the turn of the year, the SS developed a plan that entailed the continuation of the transporting of Jews to the general government in Poland, and at a later date, sending them towards former Soviet territories in the East once the upcoming battle with the Soviet Union had been won. Beyond that, nothing else seems to have been decided at this moment. For Nazis, the anti-Jewish undertones in their war against the Soviet Union, which they would launch on June 22, 1941, were quite evident. Hitler decided early on that the war would have to be conducted with unprecedented viciousness. Bolshevik leaders and intelligentsia had to be liquidated right from the get-go, and there'd be no time to prosecute German troops for committing crimes against civilians. The task of eliminating the Jewish Bolshevik intelligentsia fell upon the SS leader Himmler, who issued the first guidelines for SS occupation policy, which his right-hand man Heydrich later specified in a letter that summarized the rather open-ended instructions his task forces had been given regarding the Jewish Bolshevist intelligentsia they were supposed to be eliminating. This was very characteristic of Heydrich's leadership style that placed emphasis on personal initiative, and the SS task forces began shooting Soviet Jews in large numbers immediately after the invasion, since, again, the traditional Nazi view was to consider a powerful link between Jews and Bolshevism. The reports of the SS task forces demonstrate that tens of thousands of Soviet Jews, mainly Jewish men, were shot in June and July under the pretext of being partisans, intelligentsia, communists, communist sympathizers, or other kind of troublemakers, and that these killings were exacerbated by the two top SS leaders, Himmler and Heydrich, who pressured their men to shoot more Soviet Jews. Against the backdrop of intensifying anti-Jewish propaganda, the SS leaders felt confident that further radicalization was in accordance with the wishes of Hitler, who was receiving the reports of these task forces and who had earlier green-lighted even more indiscriminate executions so as to pacify the region as quickly as possible. Since August 1941, Soviet Jews of both sexes and including children were being killed by the SS task forces, while the executions began to gravitate towards those deemed unfit for work, as the SS fathomed that they couldn't fully dispense with Jewish slave labor. By the end of the year, the SS task forces had murdered at least 500,000 Soviet Jews, and they killed more hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews throughout 1942, adding up to a total of at least 1 million. The Soviet Union was quite universally regarded by the Nazi leadership as being a house of cards that would collapse in a matter of months, and thus soon allow large numbers of Jews to be transported towards the east, which the leader of the general government, who had been itching to get rid of the Jews under his control, was particularly thrilled about. Since the Soviet Union remained standing, a new direction in anti-Jewish policy was improvised as the Nazi euthanasia program, the T4 action, had just been brought to a halt, leaving a bunch of Nazi doctors with experience in murdering civilians suddenly being assigned to new work with SS camps. In the western half of Poland, in an administration zone known as the Warthegau, an SS officer sent a letter to his superior almost a month after the invasion, warning that German food supplies would not be enough to feed all the Jews, and suggesting that it might be more humane to simply finish off the unfit for work Jews by some quick-acting means instead of letting them starve in the winter. Luckily for the SS, a special unit had been using gas technology for killing hospital patients in that Warthegau area since early 1940, and around October 1941 took up killing Jews there in the same way. The letter correspondence between the SS leader Himmler and the Warthegau region's party leader reveals the intention at the time to have been to subject 100,000 unfit for work Jews in the region to special treatment, the term the SS preferred to use for murder. In the fall of 1941, the aforementioned SS task forces had also begun to adopt gas van technology similar to that used in the Vardegau in their Jew-killing operations in the occupied Soviet territories. A poorly camouflaged but detailed description of the gas van technology is provided in a letter dated June 5, 1942. The fall of 1941 is also when the SS constructed their first stationary gas chambers. A letter from October 25th confirms that the T4 euthanasia expert Victor Brack was at the time working on the production of what in the letter is called gassing apparatus for removing Jews unfit for work near the cities of Riga and Minsk. A year and a half later, one Nazi diplomat would write a memo describing a visit some Italian representatives had taken to Minsk and how they were shocked when shown the gas chamber used on the Jews there. Meanwhile, the leader of the Polish administration zone general government was informed in mid-October that it would not be possible to transport the Polish Jews further into the east in the near future, contrary to what the guy had been promised before the invasion. Small-scale killings had already begun in the new Galicia district of the general government, and now in the Lublin district, the regional SS leader Odilo Kloboknik or Klobochnik had been given authority by Himmler to implement his extensive and good plans for cleansing the area of Jews. The building of a camp in Kloboknik's district began in November, and the T4 euthanasia expert Brack, who had earlier been involved with the construction of a gassing apparatus for removing unfit for work Jews, started deploying his personnel to this district. In the next June, the T4 expert Brack would send a letter to Himmler stating that even more of his personnel had been assigned to assist Kloboknik in his special mission, i.e., the Jewish action that should be completed as quickly as possible for the sake of discretion. If there's any doubt about what Kloboknik's Jewish action was and why he needed so many T4 euthanasia personnel to achieve it, the propaganda minister wrote into his diary in March 1942 about the deportations of Jews that began in the Lublin district and how about 60% of these Jews will have to be liquidated, while the 40% can be put to work. During the fall of 1941, a much more radical attitude towards Jews began to permeate the whole of Nazi leadership, particularly in response to Soviet ethnic cleansing policy, which provoked the Nazis to start deporting German Jews into Polish ghettos and camps, but no plans for murdering Jews beyond the regional initiatives in occupied Soviet territories and certain districts within Poland seem to have been made by anyone at this time. Back in January 1939, Hitler had prophesied in a public speech that in the case of another world war, the Jews of Europe would be annihilated. At the time, This prophecy most certainly did not signify genocidal plans of any kind, but 2 days after declaring war on the United States in early December 1941, Hitler gave a speech in which he talked about his prophecy, making a clean sweep in regards to the Jewish question and the destruction of the Jews that must follow. While it's doubtful that this speech constituted an order by Hitler to murder the European Jews, it was clearly an appeal to further radicalize anti-Jewish politics. In a meeting with the leader of the SS on December 18th, Hitler gave his permission to continue and possibly step up the murder of the Soviet Jews under the old pretext of being partisans, according to the office diary of the SS leader. And 2 days before that, the Nazi leader of the general government said before an audience that although the Jews of Poland cannot be shot or poisoned, actions are going to be taken with the goal of extermination in mind. The logistics of how the extermination would come about were resolved for the time being at the infamous Wannsee Conference in January 1942, when the other top SS leader Heydrich presented a plan to solve the Jewish question for the whole of Europe, partly by taking advantage of the extermination site under construction on Polish territory. At the Wannsee Conference, Heydrich envisaged mass deportation of the European Jews to Eastern Europe, where those fit for work would be subjected to back-breaking forced labor during which many would perish due to natural causes, leaving the Jews of highest endurance that managed to survive needing to be dealt with accordingly. Thus, a genocidal program was already in place, but one that could be fully realized only after the war had been won, and for the most part in the form of deadly forced labor schemes for those fit for work. The fate of the Jews considered unfit or not needed for work was apparently at this stage so obvious that it could be omitted from the minutes of the conference, although the minutes do indicate that discussions did take place about starting the final solution in the general government in Poland, where the overwhelming majority of the Jews were viewed as unfit for work. Now we return back to the spring of 1942, when Kloboknik's original murder facility in the Lublin district of the general government commenced its operation, and the largely post-war final solution imagined at Wannsee began to evolve into a program of immediate murder. As mentioned earlier, the T4 euthanasia expert Victor Brack borrowed his staff members to Kloboknik also in the spring and summer of 1942, when the SS was acquiring a tighter hold on Jewish politics in the general government, accelerating the deportations of Polish Jews into camps, reducing the number of Jews required to be saved for forced labor, and erecting 2 new extermination centers, Sobibor and Treblinka, in addition to the original one in Lublin, Busets. These key decisions, among a few others, were most probably linked to a series of private meetings the SS leader Himmler had arranged with his top adjutant Heydrich and with Hitler himself around a time when programs for deporting Jews from Central Europe to the East were also properly taking shape. Subsequently, the majority of those Central European Jews deported to the East were killed on arrival, while the SS initiated deportations from Western Europe, which were increasingly reaching the Auschwitz camp complex in the general government. In the Auschwitz I camp, some killings had already begun in late 1941 using a gassing technique that was different from the T4 related facilities, and internal camp documents show that buildings in the Auschwitz II camp especially came to be fitted with gas-tight doors and gassing cellars where special treatment could take place. In early June, Himmler predicted that within a year the mass migration of the Jews will be completed, and in July he gave the order to clear out virtually all Jews in the general government by the end of 1942. A few months later, he backpedaled enough to allow a small number of fit-for-work Polish Jews to remain, although they too, in accordance with Hitler's wishes, would eventually disappear, the SS leader declared. In late July 1942, according to a letter from the Nazi State Secretary of Transport, about 5,000 Polish Jews were arriving daily at Treblinka, and there are documents to confirm that in the year 1942, hundreds of thousands of Jews, a total of nearly 1.3 million, were sent either to Treblinka, Sobibor or Buzets in the general government, which are their last known locations. In 1943, killing operations against the remaining Polish Jews continued in Treblinka and Sobibor, but around this time, when according to SS calculations only 300 to 400,000 Polish Jews were left, and deportations from outside Eastern Europe were advancing, the main focus of the Nazi extermination program began to shift to the Auschwitz camp complex, where systematic mass murder reached full speed only in 1944. The contrasting of deportation lists with camp data on how many were registered as inmates fit for work indicates that of the about 1 million Jews that arrived at Auschwitz during the war, about 865,000 were selected as unfit for work. Thus, almost 900,000 in Auschwitz, 1.3 million in 1942 in Treblinka, Sobibor and Buzets, plus 1 or 200,000 from 1943, and more than 100,000 in the Warthegau, amounts to about 2.5 million unfit for work Jewish persons that disappeared without leaving a trace from all SS records after their arrival at these camps. It was this simple fact that no shred of evidence exists for even one of these 2.5 million unfit for work Jews being transported out of these camps that convinced one of the most prominent Holocaust deniers of the early and mid-2010s to recant his views. There's no need to go any further than this. This account was intended to highlight certain specific features in the Nazis' path to genocide, and while we could summarize everything left out so far, I think that the only topic actually relevant to our current discussion about white nationalism is the ideological dimension of the genocide. The Nazis did not start from genocide, and even in May 1940, the SS leader Himmler disregarded what he called the Bolshevik method of exterminating a people as being un-German, not to mention impossible. Just over 3 years later, in October 1943, Himmler spoke in front of high-ranking SS officers about the then ongoing extermination of the Jewish people, remarking that they could not have endured the war if there remained Jews to subvert the nation, and that they had the duty to destroy the Jewish people, for the Jews were supposedly trying to destroy them. 2 days later, Himmler told members of the Nazi party elite about killing Jewish men, women and children, or having them killed, and making the Jewish people disappear from the earth, and the propaganda minister, who was present at this second speech, commented in his diary on October 7th that Himmler's extermination of Europe's Jews was brutal but logical. Hitler at least publicly rationalized the extermination of the Jews of Europe along the same lines as Himmler by recalling his so-called prophecy and asserting that the Jews were trying to exterminate the Aryan peoples but would find themselves being exterminated in retaliation. This mentality, which can be partly traced back to the Nazis' ever-present fear of Jewish Bolshevism, gained impetus in the late summer of 1941 when a book that argued for the sterilization of the German people appeared in America. It was written and published by an independent author who had no connections to any organizations or government circles, and most likely couldn't have even sold many copies of his book. But nonetheless, the book was paraded through Nazi propaganda, and many Nazis believed that it was proof of a Jewish plot to exterminate the German people. At the time, as war with the United States was appearing imminent, the Nazis were becoming more and more persuaded by the idea that world Jewry was conspiring to wage a world war to exterminate the German people. Additional thrust for this deranged view was provided in the summer of 1942 by the assassination of the second top SS leader Heydrich, which was assumed by Nazis to have been organized by Jewry, and in response, the murder operations in Poland were extended by the SS leader Himmler. When mass graves were discovered in April 1943 of Polish officers killed by the Soviets, the Nazi regime was so deeply drenched in its anti-Jewish conspiracy theories that the massacres somehow became a case in point in Jewish mass murder, and reinforced the notion that the Jews would need to be destroyed so as not to be destroyed by them. In the Nazis' fanatical anti-Semitism, individual Jews, such as the American author, became representatives of the entire Jewish ethnic group, and events, even if no Jews were connected to them, could be interpreted in a way that always seemed to profoundly affirm the worst things most Nazis must have wanted to believe about Jews all along. These incidents helped to form an ideological framework of a life and death struggle with the Jewish people, in which the Jews were pursuing the extermination of the German people. Hitler had told the new Hungarian Prime Minister on June 7, 1944, that if the Jews won, they would exterminate 30 million German individuals, presumably including the slaughter of the millions and millions and millions of Germany's finest, he had described on May 26th. And on other instances he had described sterilization, murder of women and children, slavery, and the slaughter of whole nations of people that he said the Jews were aiming for. Within this framework, the extermination of Europe's Jews could be presented as justice and an act of self-defense. These ideological aspects, since they often came up in public settings, must of course be treated with a grain of salt. Hitler had privately disclosed to the propaganda minister that the Jews need to be punished for the crimes Hitler believed they were responsible for and exterminated for being eternal parasites. And the propaganda minister himself had written down similar thoughts of his own into his diary on November 3, 1941. There is no good reason to doubt, however, that on top of the blind, emotion-based ethnic hatred, delusions about Jewish war, Jewish crimes and protecting the nation from the Jews, or taking revenge, played crucial roles in justifying the extermination of Jews in Nazi minds. We saw in part 1 that at the core of modern white nationalism lays the belief that through social engineering and the imposing of multiculturalism, Jews are committing genocide against white people. This is often called white genocide or the Great Replacement, and it means that white nationalists have already convinced themselves that they are in a life and death struggle with all Jews and also the foreigners that directly bring multiculturalism. Therefore, perceived self-defense, need for retribution, or both, could conceivably motivate white nationalists as well to commit extreme violence against the agents of destruction, and in fact, they already have. We saw that among the other ingredients of genocide were the Nazis' radical eugenics, which provided a major stepping stone in the murder of the Polish Jews, and the living space policy, which not only brought under the Nazis' control more Jews than they knew what to do with, but also helped them to view a radical removal of Jews as imperative. It might be wrong to regard these doctrines as prerequisites for mass murder, especially since the fascist-friendly, ultra-conservative Catholic nationalist regimes in Romania and Croatia, which relied on an anti-Jewish ideology primarily based on religion and anti-communism rather than race, managed to massacre tens of thousands of Jews with little or no aid from Germans and no living space or eugenics doctrine. The shift to genocide from the peaceful ethnic cleansing policy the Nazis had followed during most of the pre-war years took only a couple of years once the Nazis no longer felt constrained by the usual international considerations. Even during their pre-war peaceful ethnic cleansing policy, which is very similar to the policy most white nationalists advocate in reaching their ethno-state, violence and relentless state oppression had been present from the start. Some white nationalists might disavow violence and claim that they don't want to oppress Jews, but then again, statements could be cited of Hitler making equally bland denunciations of such things, which were forgotten at the drop of a hat the instant state power was finally attained. This doesn't mean that white nationalists will commit genocide or other kind of violence against Jews if they ever gain power. It just means that their assurances to the contrary can be ignored. Whether there's an actual possibility of mass murder on the scale of millions or hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands will be discussed in a later segment. In the living space segment, we already observed that many white nationalist figureheads have an unhealthy tendency to believe Nazi propaganda, ignore historical evidence, and take the Nazi side in the Second World War. But how deep do their sympathies go? Let's run through some of the most prominent white nationalists in no particular order. The white nationalist Mark Collett, who had probably copied his description of the ethno-state he wants to establish from Hitler, wrote that Nazism, or National Socialism, is an ideology of excellence that strives to build this ethno-state and strikes fear into the hearts of Jews who are Mark's enemies. In his book, Mark intentionally conflates Nazism with simple nationalism as if the two were the same, so that when Mark calls for the West to embrace nationalism, which he refers to using a very Hitlerian remark about nature's will, we can be sure that he really means Nazism. The white nationalist who goes by the name the Golden One has made this revealing comment about the Nazis.
And I see so many people, coming with anti-Jewish sentiments towards him just because he is Jewish. And now realize this, that there is a huge difference between the internationale clique, aka global bankers, etc., and the individual Jew. There is a huge difference. Mark Lobliner may have his faults, but is not part of the New World Order internationale clique. So keep that in mind, and if you still harbor these sort of delusions, then ask yourself this: why, in the name of God, was there so many Jews who supported Hitler and who joined the Wehrmacht during World War II if this was something against all Jews?
One person qualifies as so many. The guy Golden One mentioned wasn't even a Jew. He was part Jewish, thus, according to Nazi racial laws, not actually Jewish if he didn't practice the Jewish religion or exhibit other behavior that was seen as Jewish. But the fact that the Golden One attempted to use his misconception or lie about the Nazis being tolerant of some individual Jews to demonstrate that he and his movement are tolerant of some individual Jews would very much imply that the Golden One is unable to see a political distinction between himself and Nazis, although he might have just been looking for an excuse to sneak in his laughable Hitler apologetics without considering the implications. The Golden One's source for this part Jew argument is a certain documentary, which is one of the most shameless and dishonest Hitler worship and Holocaust denial propaganda pieces I've come across, and the Golden One has promulgated multiple times.
We've all seen the bad side of Adolf Hitler. I'd suggest that you have a glimpse at the good sides, as it were. I will link the greatest story never told below, so you can get an alternate view of things. Watch the greatest story never told. What I will do, though, is supply you with a documentary which you can watch. The greatest story never told, linked below.
That was indeed an SS symbol on his shirt there, a symbol he understands to be linked to Nazism. The white nationalist J.F. Gariepi once invited a guest onto his podcast to explain how Hitler, who advocated for mass murder and colonialism, as noted earlier, and felt little compassion even for the German people, was actually a humanitarian and in overall a wonderful person, while J.F. himself nodded and smiled.
As far as Hitler being a humanitarian, I think he was, personally. The man lived his politics, more or less, as far as kindness and courtesy and decency and respect. Anyone who, honestly, I think he would have been a very nice man to know. Very a pleasant individual, someone who's, extremely profound and intelligent. Have you ever noticed when he encounters an animal and stops and pets a dog, or pets a cat in somebody's arms? And have you ever looked at his face when he does that? That's genuine. It's not for publicity. He didn't need publicity. Germans loved him without publicity. It's things like that. In fact, he was a vegetarian. He couldn't stand the blood after World War I, and he refused to eat meat after that. He was religious on that subject.
No, we should say, I believe he was vegetarian because he had health problems, right? So it was not like vegetarian for the moral aspect of it, if I remember correctly.
Notice how the only thing JF found objectionable in that rant was his guest's characterization of Hitler as a vegetarian. And yes, it's true that Hitler's vegetarianism had to do with his health concerns, or really his hypochondria, not morality. Millennial Woes is another white nationalist figure who holds Hitler in high esteem.
I think it's safe to say that we need something similar to Hitler. If not on any other issues, then we need someone who's prepared to say, listen, we need to survive as a people. And it's really as simple as that.
There are grounds for believing that Woes added the "if not on any other issues" simply to provide himself with plausible deniability. On his Twitter account, Woes has tried his best to minimize Nazi atrocities in a way that strongly suggests that 200,000 or fewer Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, a figure less than 4% of the real one, and these Nazi apologetics came only a very short time before Woes declared himself to be pro-Wolf. In case you don't know, Wolf is the nickname Adolf Hitler liked to use, so this tweet can probably be safely taken as meaning that Woes is pro-Hitler. Lana from Red Eyes appears much less deceitful about her views on Hitler, and she has stated them quite plainly in a conversation with a self-proclaimed revisionist.
Yeah, I mean, I started listening to a lot of Hitler speeches and I was like, wow, he's speaking out against many of the same things we're talking about and conspiracy folks are also speaking out against. So I'm surprised that some of these people then turn their back on some of the things that Hitler said and don't even want to look into World War II history, the true side of it, the revisionist side, because he was saying a lot of the same things. He's warning about globalism, he's warning about communism. I mean, everything he said is coming true too. Maybe 100 years from now, Hitler is going to be some other kind of mythological hero. We'll see.
A major issue for every modern advocate of Nazism is that the ideology is seriously hindered by well-known atrocities, especially the genocide of Europe's Jews, which very few people would have any interest in repeating. As the solution, these modern advocates seek to convince themselves and the world that the Holocaust never happened and thus that Nazism is an ideology like any other, untarnished by the worst genocide of modern times. White nationalist ideology, even if distinct from Nazism, shares too many similarities in order for it to automatically escape the Nazis' reputation, and to cope with this fact, rather than stand against Nazism and denounce its crimes, white nationalists tend to rally behind Holocaust negationism to try to cover up Nazi crimes and destigmatize the ideology. Some of these white nationalists are Mark Collett.
When she studied the Holocaust, she thought, how did Hitler get over 6 million people to follow along blindly and not fight back? How indeed? Maybe you should try questioning the official narrative there, love. But anyway.
J.F. Gariepi.
Food was being withheld from Germany, which was already near starvation well before the war ended. A lot of the bodies you see outside these so-called extermination camps were nothing but people who had died, various people, prisoners, sometimes even the soldiers themselves, died from starvation, disease, typhus, diphtheria, things like that. These emaciated corpses, these weren't deliberate victims of some genocidal policy among the Germans.
That's often where we go back to as a legitimate fight against pure evil. But this pure evil seems to have been constructed by the people who have won the war. As it is said in Braveheart, those who win the wars write the history that follows. And that's pretty much what we've done with World War II.
Millennial woes, if confirmation is needed.
But I gradually realized, because he was dropping hints here and there, and I gradually realized that he actually believed the mainstream narrative about the Holocaust.
Lana from Red Eyes.
The thing when we say Holocaust, people, what they see in their mind is just piles of bodies in concentration camps, but they died from typhus, and there's a tremendous difference between being victims of raging epidemics and victims of this planned industrial mass murder and chemical slaughterhouses made for homicide, so that's the big point we need to stress here.
The golden one.
However, let us not fool ourselves. I've seen a lot of red pill guys say like, nothing bad happened to the Jews during Hitler's Germany. That is absolutely false. We have 300,000 people, Jews, dying of malnutrition in working camps. And, the Kristallnacht, it's hardly a conspiracy. If you believe that Germany during these years was a happy place for the Jewish community, that's equally stupid as believing the official narrative.
What did he mean by the Kristallnacht, i.e. the November 1938 pogrom being hardly a conspiracy? All we have is incontrovertible evidence that proves beyond any reasonable doubt that it happened. Since when has that been enough for people like this? Anyway, and there's also the white nationalist Nick Fuentes, who proudly flaunted his ignorance with this barrage of misrepresentations.
It doesn't really sound correct to me. Wait a second. It takes 1 hour to cook a batch of cookies, and you have 15 ovens, probably in 4 different kitchens, right? Doing 24 hours a day, every day for 5 years. How long would it take you to make 6 million? I don't know. It certainly wouldn't be 5 years, right? The math doesn't seem to add up there. And in addition, in this hypothetical, I imagine that if you took aerial photographs over the kitchens, you would need to see certain smokestacks to release the smoke from baking the cookies, and the smokestacks would project certain shadows, but I guess they're not visible in the aerial photographs taken over the kitchens.
No historian has ever claimed that all 5 to 6 million Jewish victims were burned in ovens or some other way. In the 3 original Polish extermination camps and the Wardegau, corpses were burned. In the occupied Soviet territories, the SS tried, albeit unsuccessfully, to burn the victims of the SS task forces, and in Auschwitz, where more bodies were burned than any other location, and by using crematoria, an unusually high cremation pace was achieved by skipping normal regulations and cremating multiple bodies in one go. According to one of the most consistently reliable testimonies of the cremation process and contemporary documents. For this reason, Auschwitz achieved a high cremation capacity of 4.7 thousand corpses per day, thus theoretically 1.7 million in 1 year. And this is not counting in the open-air cremation pits which were created in Auschwitz in early 1944. Open-air cremation pits had also been used in other extermination camps, and they increasingly became popular in Auschwitz in the summer of 1944, when most of the aerial photographs were taken, and thus they, along with the expected smokestacks, are clearly visible in the photographs. Holocaust negationism has always existed in a separate category from historical revisionism, since the latter is a legitimate practice of advancing historical interpretations when done appropriately, while the former, although sometimes only an extreme manifestation of anti-Zionism or conspiracism, is most often political activism with the intent of rehabilitating the Nazi regime. This much is quite openly explained by one of the leading figures of the current Holocaust negationist movement.
Against Germany, to get Germany to do what it's doing now, that is self-destruction. And they're not going to revert that by giving me, who is giving Germans and Europeans in general a tool, a scientific, historical tool that can be used politically to stop that self-destruction of the entire European civilization that's currently going on.
This guy appears to have lost his train of thought there. Usually negationists prefer to hide behind the term revisionism, or euphemistically call the Holocaust denier effort simply questioning things, as the white nationalist Mark Collett does in his book. This is done to frame the specific issue of Holocaust denial and Holocaust denial laws in a way that's meant to arouse suspicion in the minds of other conspiracy theorists about whether there's something about this historical event that the establishment might be trying to hide. In actuality, there are no laws against questioning things. Holocaust denial refers to a specific political phenomenon which involves accusing Jewish people of conspiring to trick the world into believing that the genocide happened, and has often been championed by extremist neo-Nazi groups. And it's not at all out of the ordinary that historical events of this kind would come to be protected by law from outright denialism in countries where the history is considered in some way politically relevant. This also concerns Soviet atrocities, the Armenian genocide, and the Rwandan genocide, to name some examples. Mark Collett is not the only white nationalist who has made this argument.
There are people in jail for having questioned certain aspects of the Second World War, and that should raise some question marks in your head. Why can't I question certain things without getting into legal trouble?
We've seen in the past how dangerous it is when people accept a government propaganda and stance on history and telling its people this or that for whatever political gain. And it is up to us. It is up to journalists to question and look into these kinds of things. But unfortunately, the climate has been so restrictive and so hard around certain things that they've started to legislate against it. And this is really the battle that we're in right now when it comes to.
Forgive me for having subjected you to all these clips, but I think it all converged on an important point. Now we have not only gotten a glimpse at some of the idiocy that passes for an argument in these white nationalist circles, where misrepresentations, confirmation bias, and wishful thinking are expected to prove that the Holocaust never happened, but we have also learned about the close relationship many white nationalists have to Nazism. There are, of course, prominent white nationalists who are not Holocaust negationists and Nazi lovers. I'm most certain that this includes Stefan Molyneux and Jared Taylor, but perhaps also Kevin MacDonald, who in the following clip refers to Holocaust negationism as something that he's not convinced by.
What are your thoughts about Holocaust revisionism?
I've never had any sympathy really for it. I haven't seen anything that would really, convince me. And frankly haven't delved into it very much. My view is that it's not important for what I'm doing, and I don't think it's really important to. I think what is important is the culture of the Holocaust, and how it's taught in schools, all those things. I think those are very important things to discuss. But whether it actually happened, exactly how many, and all that is something that I don't think is possible even go there anymore. It's just third rail.
Exactly how many wouldn't be a third rail unless Kevin thinks that the number of Jews killed could be significantly less than 5 million, which he might, given that more recently he has shared a Holocaust denial propaganda piece on his Twitter account. The article he shared is complete nonsense, and as is usual with things that Holocaust deniers somehow manage to confuse for evidence, it only leaves you puzzled about whether the person who wrote the article is a pathological liar or simply has severe reading difficulties. You can pause the video if you'd like a detailed explanation of the article, but it illustrates how susceptible Kevin is to Holocaust denial, even if he's not ready to embrace it, at least publicly. It's no wonder that so many white nationalists have such tremendous sympathy towards Hitler, since their ideologies and their manic hatred of Jewish people are to a great extent the same. Not all Nazis hated Jews in the same way or with the same intensity, but they all shared the ideological axiom that the enemy was fundamentally Jewish, which, as we have seen, could then be endlessly reaffirmed by individual Jews who by their actions or mere presence came to embody the world Jewry for Nazis. By hunting for Jews, half-Jews, and, if need be, Jewish wives of non-Jews in the enemy camp, the Nazis managed to create their own illusion that the enemy was Jewish, no matter what the circumstances might actually be. The non-Jews in this Jewish scheme were perceived as being passive drones, corrupted and manipulated by the Jews who were the real guilty party, and no kind of reasoning seemed too far-fetched, and no lie seemed too unfeasible in proving this conclusion. This type of thinking might seem positively sick to the average person, but it's what today drives many white nationalists, to whom logic also goes out the window whenever they believe to have encountered evidence that proves the wickedness of the Jewish people as a whole. White nationalists have plenty of their own Kaufmans that in their mind represent perfectly the character of the Jewish people and the nature of the enemy. White nationalism is infested by anti-Semitism of the nastiest kind, but already in part 1 we observed that some leading figures in this movement are not anti-Jewish, even though one of them, Jared Taylor, gladly invites anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers to speak at his conferences. Many trivial ideological differences can be easily found, like Nazi obsession with Freemasonry, which was largely rooted in anti-Semitism, and Nazi racism against Slavs, which fluctuated over time and never formed a core component of Nazi ideology. But a lot more devastating differences also exist. Nazi imperialism, which, as we have seen, led Hitler towards war, and was also shared by other leading Nazi figures to varying degrees, constitutes one of the most crucial differences. However, of even greater significance is the leadership principle manifested in Hitler, which was more than just a form of regime governance. As the Führer, Hitler was the leader of the party and the state, and his often broadly defined ideological dictates drove his subordinates, all of whom were loyally committed to achieving his wishes. Hitler never had to micromanage the regime, since all Nazis were united in their understanding of Hitler as the supreme leader who represented the Nazi idea, and whose will, however vague at times, was the one goal they all knew they had to work towards. By embracing the Führer principle, Nazis and many other German nationalists willingly surrendered their fate as well as that of their nation to the leadership of one man who was a raging anti-Semite with plans of conquest towards the east and a dubious psychological profile. The personal role of Hitler and his leadership style can thus be singled out as primary causes of everything Nazism led to, including world war and genocide. This absence of imperialist ideology and the leader cult as the driving force of white nationalism is enough to answer in the negative the question of whether white nationalism is the same as Nazism. They are never in fact the same thing, and white nationalists cannot be Nazis, not even if they might identify as such. Nazism emerged out of the broader German racial nationalist movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which has often been described with the term Völkisch. This Völkisch racial nationalist movement bore many of the characteristics people today might associate exclusively with Nazism, like Aryan racial supremacy, anti-Semitism, and the ethno-state or national community. Some Völkisch groups of the pan-German branch of nationalism even envisioned conquest of ethnically German territories in Eastern Europe, but imperialism, in the sense it came to dominate much of Nazi policy, was not a defining trait. One of the world's foremost experts on Hitler has noted that before adopting the living space doctrine, Hitler's worldview was virtually indistinguishable from other Völkisch movements, and thus I think it's fair to say that without the imperialism and also the leader cult, white nationalism fits much more aptly this broader Völkisch movement than specifically Nazism. With these revelations we have gotten closer to answering another question that has come up. Could white nationalist ethnic cleansing policy lead to mass murder of millions, even in a country like the US, where the non-white and Jewish populations remain so high? The answer is no. During the Second World War, civilians of all kinds were killed in larger numbers than ever before in European history, and that wouldn't have been possible without the brutalized political climate Germany had inherited as the legacy of the First World War, in which life had become cheaper, violent paramilitary groups were commonplace, and the hated Versailles Treaty that codified Germany's national humiliation instilled a deep yearning for a Bismarck-like hero to revive the nation. None of this has been present in North America or any European state in decades, even though war on an infinitely smaller scale has been, and yet without them, and Hitler's and Nazism's unique role in harnessing them, destruction on the Nazi scale would not have been possible. From every angle, it seems that an absolute precondition for the mass murder was the Second World War, which, at least in Germany, sprung from the seeds of the First World War and also forced economic concerns that propelled anti-Jewish policy, and it's hard to imagine that without it, and the unprecedented whirlwind of violence against civilians it had unleashed, Romania and Croatia could have carried out their atrocities, although I don't know enough about those two situations to say for sure. These are, in any case, the main reasons why I think it's unlikely that mass murder against Jews or other groups, beyond the kind of individual acts we have already seen, could be in the cards for white nationalism, at least not until some new political cataclysm. However, This is not too much of a happy ending, since even without the mass murder, the kind of state oppression and spontaneous acts of violence by individuals which can be more or less guaranteed in a white nationalist future are as good as a nightmare in terms of modern sensibilities. It doesn't have to be this way. There's no good reason for why white nationalism would have to be more radical and taboo than other forms of ethno-nationalism, but it will be for as long as its proponents continue to embrace the worst kinds of racism and walk in the footsteps of the Nazis. If white nationalists learned to reject the ultra-racism and accept the truth about the Nazi regime, perhaps they could escape their current infatuation with murderous racism, and one day people wouldn't have such a damn good reason to despise white nationalism. Thank you for watching. I will try to make one more video before retiring.